December 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Soon after, 10 other states in the Deep South joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. Within the year, the North and South were at war. The Civil War would split the nation in two. It would rage on for 4 years, cost 600,000 lives, and wound many more in body and spirit. It was a bloody war that at times pitted brother against brother. American men, some as young as 15 and 16 years old, slaughtered each other in small-town streets, wheat fields, and apple orchards. Whole cities were destroyed. How could this happen in America? The North and South had always had their disagreements, but they had been able to put them aside to form a union, the United States of America. So what changed? Why did Southern states decide to split from the North? What brought on the unimaginable horrors that nearly split America forever? In the early 1800s, America was growing in leaps and bounds. In the North, internal improvements and trade were the order of the day. Investors poured millions of dollars into transportation systems that would connect one region to the next for the benefits of trade. Completion of the Erie Canal made its investors wealthy men as food and produce poured into New York from the west and manufactured goods floated to the interior. A building boom in canals quickly followed. When Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb puffed out of Baltimore in 1830, few thought much of it. But by 1860, 30,000 miles of railroads linked the nation together. Europe too grew closer as the shift from sail to steam engine cut the travel time to Liverpool from New York from a couple of months to a couple of weeks. Most people still worked on farms, but the North was rapidly industrializing. Using new machines and interchangeable parts, Northern factories poured out sewing machines, farm machinery, clothing, and other goods. Americans were so good at it that the British called the making of things by machine rather than hand the American system of manufacturing. Industry created jobs. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany and teenagers from American farms poured into northern cities like Lowell, Massachusetts and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to work as wage earners in factories. Stores sprung up, shelves brimming with goods to sell to workers. Banks sprung up to finance business and trade. A booming market economy was transforming the North. Life was quite different in the South. There, agriculture was the major source of jobs and wealth. Long growing seasons and rich soil produced rice, tobacco, and cotton, cash crops grown for sale in distant markets. The vast majority of Southern whites were poor farmers who eked out a living as best they could. But big plantation owners with many slaves dominated the South, economically, socially, and politically. The North had outlawed slavery in the decades following the American Revolution. Back then, many Americans believed that slavery would die out on its own because it was no longer profitable. But then something happened. Raw cotton had always been very expensive because it took too long to separate the sticky seeds from the fiber. Then, in 1793, Eli Whitney, a young teacher from New England, invented the cotton gin. With this simple machine, a slave could clean more than 50 pounds of cotton a day. The cotton gin transformed cotton from a luxury item into the world's cheapest fabric. Booming textile factories in the northern states and England paid good money for all they could get, and the South was the world's major supplier.
There was a bigger demand for cotton, and in order to get that cotton, the South needed a lot of land. To work the land, they needed a large labor force, and the largest, cheapest labor force available was the enslaved African.
Doubling in value every 10 years, cotton production soon dominated the Southern economy. The Cotton Belt spread west across the South. Close to 1 million slaves were marched in chains to the southern frontier, where they cleared land and grew cotton to make their masters rich.
So by the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the states in the South, the Deep South, were really committed to slavery because it gave them an economic advantage.
The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran the fastest, there he whipped the longest.
Southern wealth rested on the backs of slaves. Even though some slave owners treated their slaves well, Southern slavery was brutal, degrading, and deadly. Dressed only in coarse linen clothing, children received only 2 shirts a year. When these failed them, they went naked, winter or summer. It was not uncommon for slaves to work from dawn to dusk, then do their own washing, mending, and cooking before falling to sleep. They slept on cold, damp, bare floors, often with only a coarse blanket, even in the cold of winter. Slaves considered a good master one who gave them enough to fill their stomachs. Many had barely enough to eat. Believing that slaves couldn't be governed except with the whip, masters and overseers beat men and women, young and old, even pregnant women, for any reason or for none. Born a slave in Maryland, Frederick Douglass revealed the hardships and horrors of slavery in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. According to Douglass, to be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished.
Frederick Douglass in his autobiography talks about seeing a young mother beaten while her children watched, unable to do anything to stop them. And this is something that's hard for us to understand, but we just need to remember that the enslaved people were not considered people, they were considered property.
Douglass escaped in 1838 and soon thereafter became one of America's most powerful voices against slavery. Not every black man and woman in the South was a slave.
In the 1800s, during the period that slavery was still very much alive in this country, there were tens of thousands, actually, of African people, people of African descent, who were free, one way or another. They had run away, they had managed to get free after their slave owners died, their relatives bought them out, and sometimes out of conscience, people would release their slaves.
Some of them traveled north, particularly places like Philadelphia, and increased the black population. And it was through free black community building that the modern black community emerged, so with churches, with organizations, with a sense of self. And even as they tried to become Americans, they also wanted to hold on to this separate identity. So it was a free black population that was increasingly conscious of its place in America and its need to define its place in America.
They held a variety of occupations. They were draymen, they were bricklayers, they were carpenters, and in fact, in Charleston, most of the building trades were dominated by free blacks.
But such cases were rare indeed. The vast majority of African Americans lived and died as slaves. Despite the harsh treatment, African American slaves and free blacks built a world of their own. Mixing African and American traditions, they poured out their joys and sorrows in music and dance, practiced their own brand of soulful Christianity, held on to their families as best they could, and carried on their private lives in the secrecy of the slave quarters. They resisted slavery in many ways, breaking tools, burning down barns and houses, running away to the north or to Indian tribes on the frontier. Some poisoned their masters. Some revolted. In 1811, slaves marched on New Orleans and were defeated in a pitched battle. Their decapitated heads were hung on poles as a warning to others. The greatest of all the uprisings took place in Southampton County, Virginia, and was led by a slave preacher named Nat Turner.
As I was praying one day at my plow, the Spirit spoke to me, saying, Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you. I was greatly astonished, and for 2 years prayed continually. I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun darkened.
And he led a group of about 6 men heading from his owner's farm to an area called Jerusalem. On the way there, they killed 61 whites. The federal and state troops were called out against them, but they were able to elude them for about 6 weeks. Then they were captured, and he and 16 others were executed.
News of Turner's revolt spread terror throughout the South. Imagine what would happen if other slaves, now 1/3 of the Southern population, followed Turner's lead.
People lie down to sleep with fear. They hardly venture out on nights. A lady told me that for weeks after the tragedy, she had quivered at every blast of wind and every blow of the shutter.
White Southerners came to fear their slaves ever more, and so they clamped down. You see a whole series of post-Nat Turner laws that to make sure that the slave patrols actually went out on patrol to make sure that the slaves weren't assembling somewhere and gathering weapons and going to rise up against their masters. Laws passed to prevent slaves from learning how to read and write so they couldn't communicate with one another and couldn't get these ideas, because one of the other things white Southerners thought about was that, well, they couldn't have gotten ideas of freedom on their own account. They must have come from someplace else. Where? Why, they must have come from those abolitionists up in the North.
The Americans say that we are ungrateful, but I ask them, for heaven's sake, what should we be grateful to them for? For murdering our fathers and mothers? Or do they wish us to return thanks to them for chaining and handcuffing us, branding us, cramming fire down our throats, or for keeping us in slavery and beating us nearly or quite to death to make us work in ignorance and miseries, to support them and their families?
The publication of former slave David Walker's Appeal in 1829 hit the South like a thunderbolt. Calling for violent rebellion by slaves, it was the most vigorous denunciation of slavery ever published in the U.S.
In fact, the slaveholders in the South called upon the governor of Massachusetts to arrest David Walker, and they issued a $10,000 reward ransom for his head.
No compromise with slavery. No union with slaveholders,
cried William Lloyd Garrison, who, after reading Walker's Appeal and seeing slavery in practice on a visit to Baltimore, started the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. Calling for an immediate end to the institution of slavery, his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, quickly became the most important abolitionist publication in the country. Garrison pulled no punches in his denunciation of slaveholders.
We would sooner trust the honor of the country in the hands of the inmates of our penitentiaries and prisons than in their hands. They are the meanest of thieves and the worst of robbers. We do not acknowledge them to be within the pale of Christianity or republicanism or humanity.
Such strong talk alarmed not just Southerners, but Northerners as well, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. Most Americans thought of abolitionists as dangerous troublemakers. Angry crowds nearly lynched Garrison in Boston, burned down the new Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia, and murdered Elijah P. Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois. Many others would also lose their lives in the fight against slavery. Despite violence and opposition, the abolitionist movement quickly grew in the North among ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Free blacks in the North also played a key role in the abolitionist movement. They organized themselves into local anti-slavery societies and worked hand in hand with whites for the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad, of course, was not underground, and it was not a railroad. It was a hidden method of slaves to escape from the South to freedom either in the North or all the way to Canada.
Escaped slaves also played major roles. Frederick Douglass, William Box Brown, and Sojourner Truth wrote autobiographies and gave lectures on the horrors of slavery.
Then, of course, you had Harriet Tubman, who became a conductor in the Underground Railroad, who returned to the South at least 15 times and freed some 300 African Americans from slavery.
Causes leading to the Civil War, the road to division.
Wait, not the small town in Missouri?
What is it about a bargain that makes us get a little crazy? We love getting a great deal so much that we don't always care how we get it.
Oh no!
Or who gets it for us. In 1860, the North and South couldn't agree on much of anything. The North liked to hang out in cities, while Southerners were partial to their plantations. The North liked making stuff, and the South preferred growing stuff. On top of that, the North's economy was in high gear, while the South's was dependent on pretty much one thing: cotton. And that brings us to the biggie, slavery. The South was counting on cheap, free labor to harvest all that cotton, and weren't crazy about Northerners nosing around in their business. Then that troublemaker Lincoln gives a speech saying the government had the right to halt slavery. He later adds that it shouldn't be allowed to spread to new territories either, which ticks off the South even further. After the Republican Party nominates the guy for president, the Democratic Party splits, when much of the South withdraws from the Democratic Convention.
Come on, Fluffy, let's blow this pop stand.
After Lincoln wins the election, things get interesting in a hurry. Decades of tension between North and South were set to blow like a science fair volcano. Several states threatened to leave the Union.
Georgia, let's skedaddle.
Forcing Lincoln and his buddies to think fast. By the end of December 1860, South Carolina has had enough. As a last-ditch effort to keep the country together, the Crittenden Compromise is proposed to continue slavery where already practiced.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
But that doesn't work either. Within 2 months, 6 more states are ready to bolt, and the you-know-what is about to hit the fan. The seceded states form a separate union called the Confederate States of America and elect Jefferson Davis as their first, not to mention their last, president. Slight problem. It's not recognized by the U.S. or any other government. Lincoln refuses to recognize the Confederacy.
I can't see you.
But tries to reason with the seceded states.
We got candy over here.
Meanwhile, that Stevens guy is appointed vice president of the Confederacy. He says the cornerstone of the Confederacy is that blacks are unequal to whites, and that slavery is their natural condition.
It's just the way it ought to be.
Tensions increased over several months, leading to the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. After a 34-hour bombardment, the Union fort surrenders, and the Civil War begins. Buckle up, soldiers. It's going to be a long 4 years.
The Lincolns and their guests arrive at Ford's in high spirits.
The crowd applauds the president. They stop the play. They sit down, and the play begins.
It comes to their barking up the wrong tree about the old...
About 10 minutes after 10, Booth began to mount the stairs leading up to the second tier of boxes where you would find President Lincoln.
As Booth makes his way toward the presidential box, he is seen, but no one stops him.
He was well known to everyone, a popular actor, of course. And that let Booth get right behind Lincoln.
Not used to the manners of a good society.
Booth is in position at Ford's.
Booth comes into the box right as the whole theater bursts into laughter.
As the crowd roars with laughter, Booth takes aim.
Stop mythologizing old man trap.
And so that moment where the whole future looked like had finally lifted, the clouds had separated, comes crashing down.
The bullet enters the back of Lincoln's head.
Booth stepped up to him, fired a shot from perhaps 3-4 inches, not right against Lincoln's head, but close, and it hit Lincoln in the back of the head, like a sledgehammer would. This is the Derringer that Booth used on April 14. It's about 6 inches long, weighs about 8 ounces.
A part of the Ford's theater collection, this instrument of history was Booth's personal weapon.
Booth probably had this weapon for at least 5 or 6 years before the assassination took place. It fires a single bullet, so this is like we say, one and done. Booth dropped the pistol, went to the front of the box intending to escape. Major Rathbone jumped from his seat. He grabbed Booth from behind and pulled him back from the railing. Booth twisted around in the Major's grip, and for the first time the men were face to face. And Rathbone later said he was absolutely horrified by the look on Booth's face. And Booth was stronger than Rathbone was, so he was able to free himself and slash Rathbone with a knife.
Yeah!
Booth leaps from the box to the stage.
Sic semper tyrannis!
And makes his escape.
Walt Whitman was the man who revolutionized American poetry. He invented a whole new poetic form, and he opened up topics to a wide range that nobody else would touch.
Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819, in West Hills, New York. His parents were of modest means, and he had 7 siblings.
At the age of 11, Walt Whitman was pulled from school so that he could help the family support itself in the printing industry. As a result, Whitman was largely self-taught.
He became a voracious reader. He read widely, especially in novels.
When he was 17, Whitman turned to teaching, and his first job was in a one-room schoolhouse. He taught for 5 years, and then in 1841, he set his sights on journalism.
Walt Whitman was a volatile editor and writer. He had strong ideas about women's property rights, about immigration, and about the major issue of the day, slavery.
From 1848 to 1855, Whitman began what was to become his greatest work, Leaves of Grass. His free verse, his stitching together of encyclopedic lists, completely broke with poetic and literary convention, and vastly influenced poets ever after, across the world.
It began as a book of very few poems and grew to one over the years to contain almost 300 poems. Over his lifetime, he had 7 editions of the book.
During the Civil War, Whitman moved to Washington, D.C. to attend his wounded brother George. He stayed in D.C. several years, working in the paymaster's office, and volunteered, visiting wounded soldiers.
When he went to the hospitals, there were limbs piled up outside. He spoke with young soldiers who had witnessed the most astonishing atrocities.
From his experience with the wounded during the war, he produced a small book of poems called Drum Taps. This is one of the only 2 accounts of the Civil War written by people who actually experienced it.
Whitman published 2 new collections of poems in 1870, Democratic Vistas and Passage to India.
Whitman was called the Bard of Democracy because all of his poems are based on the notion of a universal brotherhood. He thought that the possibility of America was to achieve a brotherhood that no other culture had yet been able to achieve.
Whitman suffered a stroke in 1873, leaving him partially paralyzed. He moved to Camden, New Jersey, where he remained until his death on March 26, 1892.
In his lifetime, Leaves of Grass was considered by many people to be a disgraceful book. But by the end of his life, he acquired the name the Good Gray Poet, as if America was finally ready in the later years to accept him as a poet.
Whitman never really received the attention that he deserved during his lifetime. It was only in the 20th century that we learned how to read his poetry and understand what he accomplished.
Our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, like most beloved people, had a lot of nicknames. The Great Emancipator, the Rail Splitter, and Honest Abe. But how about the Repairman? Because when our nation was badly broken, Abe Lincoln stepped in to fix it. There are 2 facts everyone knows about Abe Lincoln. He was born in a log cabin, and he was our tallest president. Although he became tall long after he left the log cabin. Few thought that this tall, awkward man would ever become president.
If you look at him as a youngster, one would not have predicted he would have done much but become another farmer like his father or gone further west and become a hunter. But he wanted to learn. He had ambitions, he had dreams.
Lincoln educated himself and became a respected lawyer and public figure in Springfield, Illinois. Thankfully, this was in the mid-19th century, back when image wasn't everything.
There's a lot of people who say Abe Lincoln couldn't win today. He was really tall and gangly and goofy looking, and he actually had a terrible voice. He had a really high, squeaky voice for a big guy.
But while Abe Lincoln might not have had the most impressive voice, the words that he spoke in the 1850s, when the young Republican Party was leading the charge against slavery, commanded attention.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free.
What is stunning to me about Lincoln is the idea that he can hold that belief through 4 years of civil war. It's that he doesn't turn back from it. He doesn't imagine that there's some compromise.
During a Senate run in 1858, Lincoln said some surprising things during a series of slavery debates with rival Stephen Douglas, like that slavery violated the natural rights of black people. Lincoln lost that Senate race, but won the Republican nomination for president. And as Lincoln became president, the divided nation split into all-out civil war. Lincoln was determined to hold the nation together.
The reason we are one United States of America today is only because of Abraham Lincoln. A lesser leader would have allowed the South to go, maybe not even had that war.
Lincoln was the best wartime president. He had one goal, to save the Union. He would do it by whatever tactic he needed.
One of those tactics was to suspend habeas corpus, which essentially meant that an American could be tossed in jail and held without evidence in the name of protecting national security.
Ensuring the civil liberties and the rights of the citizen is one of the giant tasks of any president during wartime. If you go back to Lincoln, in a sense, he failed the test. He violated the Constitution.
Thankfully, Abe proved he was back on the side of civil liberties by deciding to make good on that whole all men are created equal thing in the Declaration of Independence. In 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to end slavery in the United States.
And Lincoln saves the Union and recreates the American story, despite the fact that Lincoln was ambivalent about the question of slavery, and certainly deeply ambivalent about the question of black equality.
Our greatest president, I'm going to be very cliche about this, was Abraham Lincoln, because he brought us through the greatest of our problems. The great divide in American history was the Civil War. And the great divide in American history was the black-white divide, where whites were free and blacks were unfree.
The South surrendered to the North in 1865, effectively ending the Civil War. But one of its last victims was Abe Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth's bullet may have ended the life of the great emancipator, but his words and deeds live on to this day.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.